on the next episode of Talkin Thrones. We talk about Jon Snow and his struggles up at the wall. Ned finally arrives at King's Landing and uncovers already, of course, that some nefarious happenings are happening in King's Landing. All of that today on today's episode of Talkin Thrones. I am Dom the Movie Nerd. Pat, you have anything to say before we start?
Yeah, we're going to be talking TV today for sure. And it's going to be Jon Snow's demotion to president of the Babysitters Club.
Oh, man, you got to bring the Babysitters Club into this, man? What do you have against that show? All that and more on today's episode of Talkin Thrones. Stay tuned. All right, people, we're back. Episode 3. We've managed to make it this far so far, so it definitely, I think, bodes well for our trip up to the finale. Pat, you up for it today?
Yeah, it's been a long journey. 3 hours of television.
The boredom jokes are already seeping in. We're only 3 episodes in.
Yeah, I know. I actually, the first episode was, it was hard to watch.
It was the first episode.
For sure. It was not like the greatest pilot I've ever seen, but
definitely no Sopranos or Breaking Bad pilot.
Yeah, episode 2 definitely got me amped, back into the series. I thought it was moving swimmingly. And then this episode sort of brings us back a little bit, more, explaining and introducing characters. And, there are a lot of characters in the show, and you just got to get started at the beginning of the series and introduce everybody, or at least a good bulk of the main characters, and then go from there.
Yeah, you're not kidding about the amount of characters that this show has overall. Because, just off the top, I lost track of how many characters this episode introduced, but I off the top of my head, there were like 8 or 9 like named characters that will like eventually, if not play a part in. It's like you got Littlefinger, Varys, Grand Maester Pycelle, Renly Baratheon, Barris and Selmy, all introduced for the first time in this episode, amongst many others. I can see we're already getting some comments in the chat below. As always, we'll hit all of the comments in the episodes. Let's go at the end of the episode. But yeah.
Well, Dom, you forgot the other characters. Bordello member 1, Bordello member 2, Bordello customer.
A lot of Bordello customers in this. I still love the bit where it's like Ned is so offended by the idea of Littlefinger taking him to a brothel that he's willing to strangle him. It's like, bro, what? It's like, I get that you're from the Great White North and you haven't like been around civilization in a while, but geez, like learn to take a joke, literally to the point where Littlefinger makes a joke about it afterwards.
But speaking into that was a great contrast between sort of King's Landing, big city living, and Ned Stark.
Yes.
Who, is from the North, and that's sort of, we're led to believe, the sort of vast wilderness backward kingdom, that's not quite as hip as King's Landing.
Definitely. So it's safe to say that we're past kind of like the setup point, I guess, that the first 2 episodes were in. We're officially into the swing of things, right? Ned's in King's Landing. Jon's in training at the wall. Danny's really learning how to like get into the Kalistar lifestyle, right? Things are ramping up. We're still not quite to the point yet, I feel like, where things are really starting to get going. Obviously, this is, like we said at the top, it's safe to say this is another big setup episode, but like we're getting into the swing of things. Obviously, I think it's safe to say. So episode 3, Lord Snow, is directed by Brian Kirk, who only directed 2 other episodes in the show, that being the 2 after this, and was written again by Benioff and Weiss. Again, they've written a majority of the series overall. I think it's safe to say that this is not a lot of people's favorite episodes, nor is it technically an important one, but it's one of those episodes for me that has a lot of moments in there that I always love, but I never quite pinpoint where they are. And then when I rewatch them, I'm like, oh, I forgot this moment happened in this episode. Oh, I forgot this moment happened in this episode, It's like, it's one of those weird little episodes of TV where even though it's not the most important to the plot, and if it were a lesser show, it would be considered a quote-unquote filler episode, but because it's Game of Thrones, and because obviously it has a gigantic fan base, and because obviously it has so many, like little moments and, and just special little characters that are known for each episode, I'll always go back to like, you know, the moments between Yoren and Tyrion when they're sitting and drinking, the moments between Robert, Barristan Selmy, and Jaime. The moment at the end, obviously, when Arya meets Syrio Forel, that's another one who's around only for this season. But man, I freaking love that character just because of like what he provided like kind of like a second like kind of maternal figure for Arya in addition to that, you know, kind of continuing that track of her journey, you know? It's just like all the well, it's not necessarily like the best episode overall, nor is it I feel like, again, nor is it there that much important stuff happening. This episode to me was the one where I'm like, oh man, I forgot how many awesome little moments there were, like moments that like take me back to remembering when I read them in the books originally.
Yeah, for me, this episode, it's one of those.
You took that transition like, well.
No. I don't know. I haven't had my final thought about this episode because typically what happens is like we do the Talkin Thrones on Sunday, and then like Monday I watch the next episode for the first time, and then typically on the next Sunday, just a few hours before we go live, I watch the episode again, and I judge my excitement basically of watching it again years later versus my excitement watching it 7 days later or whatever it is, 6 days later. And this episode was very much like, okay, I'm the second watch within 6 days. It's definitely on the back burner.
Yeah.
So it was one of those things where I think there are great moments, like you say. Specifically, I think the sword dancing at the end really does stick in mind. Like I a big smile on my face both times that I watched the episode this week because that scene has a lot of charisma.
Yes.
And so does that character. And I think I totally forgot that character existed.
Yeah.
After watching 8 seasons of this show.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot obviously to keep track of, and a lot of characters coming and going. And again, there's a lot of characters that were introduced to this episode. So without further ado, you want to get into what actually happens in this episode?
Yeah, I think basically it falls into a couple of different categories, and the main thing that we should talk about is just introduction to King's Landing.
Yeah.
It starts off Ned and basically his daughters and his basically
his posse, if you will.
Yeah, I guess a posse is
entourage.
A good word. I didn't want to say just like workers, but a posse.
I was about to say, let's put it down all the noble knights that end up brutally dying later on in the season.
Yeah, posse's really entourage is another one.
Yeah,
that's probably a good way to describe them. But they arrive and immediately Ned is told, we need you in this meeting. So all the other characters, from Winterfell kind of go off screen to get settled in, and we get thrown right into the middle of Ned goes to this little council meeting, but on his way, Jaime Lannister sort of decides to talk to him about a little bit of sword fighting, right?
A little bit of sword fighting, and again throwing more context in as far as informing us about, again, what we discussed last week about obviously the Mad King and the murder of Ned's father and brother at his hands. And obviously famously Jaime, again, they've been alluding to this for some time, but again, it's known again that in the history of that during the sack of King's Landing, Jaime famously killed Mad King Aerys Targaryen, a deed for which Ned is constantly held against him, and it's kind of created this weird and very interesting little animosity that this moment furthers, where again, like Jaime almost wants Ned to like give him credit for like avenging his father and brother, but Ned only looks at him as disdain for breaking his vow. It creates this very, very interesting dynamic between the two that is really, really fascinating the more and more and more I think about it, Yeah,
and I also think, this early in the show, having Jaime kind of confront him at the beginning of this episode, it really pours on really thick the whole idea that the Lannisters are evil. And specifically knowing where Jaime's character goes over the course of this series, it's like, wow, this guy starts off like pure evil, and somehow, he
we end up loving him by the end.
Yeah, it's like a Grinch story. His heart grows
kind of
5 times in one episode.
Yeah,
and then all of a sudden we're on his side. But like at the start of the series, it's like
Yeah.
Jamie, you know,
Yeah, it's like
blonde
Jamie.
bastard number one.
It's like just like, oh, repulsive Lannister number one. It's like the Lannisters are like all, with the exception of Tyrion, are like all competing with each other about who can out repulse the other. You know, you're introduced to Joffrey, Jamie, and Cersei, and then later on when Tywin comes in and he just reveals why he's the head honcho of the Lannister family. It's like, oh wow, it's like how are we supposed to root for these guys at all? And by the end, you like actually find new and interesting ways, if not to love them, then to just hate them more. But yeah, so obviously Ned then steps in on a small council meeting, and we're introduced to, in this scene again, 4 new characters. Obviously, Grand Maester Pycelle, portrayed by Julian Glover, famously of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade fame. Robert's youngest brother, Renly Baratheon, portrayed by Jen Anthony. Varys, the Master of Whisperers, portrayed by Conleth Hill. And of course, Peter Littlefinger Baelish, portrayed by Aidan Gillen, this is not the first HBO show he was on. He portrayed Mayor Tommy Carcetti, famously from seasons 3 to 5 of The Wire. Another fascinating character, and already like this menagerie of characters that we're introduced to is kind of setting the stage and the tone for King's Landing, as far as it's like, yeah, this is quite literally a nest of vipers that Ned has found himself in. You know, these are not people, these are not honorable people by any stretch of the imagination, the way that Ned is.
Dom, you got to tell me which one of these characters is your favorite character.
Renly's my least favorite, because I feel bad for Renly both because of what his arc is throughout the show progressively, but also by just fact of like, because he quite literally is the runt of the litter, because he's not as physically imposing as Robert, nor is he as cunning or smart as Stannis is, as we later are introduced to. And so he's constantly stuck with the runt of the litter, and it really sucks because even though he's constantly made out to be like the weakest Baratheon, it is very possible that he might have been like the best king had he actually been crowned, but it's just a simple fact of youngest child syndrome. No one's willing to give him a chance, and he dies before he actually has a chance to like make his mark.
So forget about him.
Yeah,
right?
Pycelle's forgettable. Pycelle literally by the end of his tenure just becomes everyone's punching bag, and I feel like the books kind of recognize that too.
He's interesting. Pycelle is sort of like, the way I would put it, let's say Pycelle is the Game of Thrones as Sideshow Bob is The Simpsons. You know, he's sort of a comedic character.
Of all the characters that you could have pulled, Sideshow Bob is the one you go with.
Well, Pycelle is sort of, he's always part of some plot, and it's always,
and he becomes less and less important as the show goes on, but he always seems to be there. Like, even by the 6th season, which is his last season of the show, and the small council has changed so drastically by then. Like, Varys is gone, Littlefinger's gone, Renly's long dead, all the other members who have come in and out throughout the show. It's like a completely different roster, and Pycelle's still there, and you're like, oh shit, oh yeah, Pycelle is still there. And then by the time he dies, it's almost like, oh wait, he didn't die already? He's only dying now, you know? So I feel like that becomes Pycelle's role on the show as time goes on. But I mean, it's no secret, obviously, that as time goes on, Littlefinger and Varys constantly seem like they're in a competition in order to like try and out mysterious each other and like out charm each other, as far as like who's the more mysterious and cunning of it, right? As far as kind of their own individual motivations. And it really sucks because they're both intensely fascinating characters that are both completely mucked about by the last couple of seasons of the show. But I always find it interesting kind of setting the dynamic up right there, right? Obviously, like Varys obviously trying to be all like coy and approaching Ned and seeming to be all genuine.
Dom, you seem to be dodging this issue. Is it Varys or Littlefinger?
I can't decide. That's the problem. I mean, just for terms of like how they morally righteous go, I gotta go with Varys, but like I admire Littlefinger just for the fact that he gives no shits about anyone other than himself and can just twist quite literally. Again, I feel like this metaphor is a little bit too on the nose, but everyone around his little fingers, you know?
I'm gonna say Littlefinger is definitely my favorite, because you gotta like the heel, right? The bad guy that,
right.
You know, obviously he helps other characters, but it's all for his sort of own good. But he's sort of this bad guy that thinks he's going to somehow get to the throne,
right?
By doing these manipulations,
right?
And I think just played so well by that actor,
Aidan Gillen.
Yeah, Aidan Gillen. And I think it's one of those things where, like, you know, watching The Wire and then kicking over to Game of Thrones and being like, I know that guy.
Right. But what's even, and I love that comparison that you bring up, because it's so fascinating to me how much of the opposite type of a character is opposite, but also same side, like quite literally two opposite sides of the same coin. Where in The Wire, the whole thing about his character is he is super idealistic and wants the mayor's seat because he actually wants to bring about some change in what's it called? He actually wants to bring about change in Baltimore, and then ultimately just becomes like so weighed down by the political baggage that he completely forgets about why he got the position in the first place. Versus this one, he is so intensely focused on that throne to the point where he's willing to step over everyone else to get to it. You know, literally to the point where he just manipulates person after person after person.
What I will say is that Varys and Littlefinger sort of, take over a large part of this episode because Catelyn Stark is coming into King's Landing, trying to catch up with Ned and, reveal the plot that the Lannisters probably, had something to do with Bran falling off the tower. And what happens immediately as Catelyn comes in is like, hey, we're, come with us. And it's like,
yeah,
what do you?
It's like they already knew that she was coming before she got there, and that again, I think, is such a great indication as far as setting up, continuing to set up just how out of their element the Starks are. Whereas the Starks, again, very honorable people, but again, their whole thing is they are only really used to being in the wilderness, basically, the wilds of the North, and basically dealing with it and having to trust and rely on each other for survival. They're not ready for the political games and the manipulation and the backstabbing and the constant kissing up that comes from experiencing King's Landing. It's part of the reason, again, that inevitably leads to kind of all of these current generation of Starks downfalls, as far as Ned not really know what he's into. Catelyn literally, they know that she's coming before she even gets there.
Yeah, I think it's very subtle the way that they set up Varys. He's the master of secrets, and he found out that she's coming. He does a scheme with Littlefinger to get her into the bordello to hide her, make sure that no one knows she's around.
Right.
Littlefinger then basically gets Ned to come over and allow them to compare notes about this.
This plot obviously with the dagger. He reveals that the dagger was his, that he lost to Tyrion Lannister. Obviously, we know again it's a ploy. He is obviously setting this up. Yeah. We obviously know that Tyrion had nothing to do with the murder or the pushing Bran out the tower.
One thing that I wanted to ask you is just this whole scene sets up that dynamic between the fast-paced sort of city life of King's Landing versus the way things are in Winterfell, which is sort of out in the open, honor. You're known for your word, right? And you do tell the truth, and you do put yourself out there, and you have oaths that you swore, and you do uphold them. And that's the type of life that the Starks go through, right? Winter is coming. Winter is multiple years in this world, and you have to trust the people that you're with, right? So King's Landing, that's not the case, right? It's
not at all.
Everybody has skills, everybody's horse trading, and I think that's really at the core of this episode. Is setting up the dynamic between the North and the South, so to speak, in this world, and just how people think and how there's different ways of thinking that sort of, the Starks are coming into that world.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. And I think it's also greatly contrasted by kind of seeing what happens to Jon in this episode, right? So that's pretty much a majority of what happens in King's Landing. The only really other big point that we'll kind of get to when we cover the what's it called? We cover kind of the review of the week, but I think that's greatly contrasted by what we see Jon go through, where in this episode we see Jon at the wall, finally, training with the rest of his brothers in arms in order to become a member of the Night's Watch. We're introduced to kind of the whole Night's Watch section of the group. Like, we met the King's Landing, posse of characters. Now we meet the Night's Watch, posse of characters, that being Lord Commander Jorah Mormont, portrayed by longtime character actor James Cosmo, also Jorah Mormont's father, Sir Alliser Thorne, the Master of Arms, portrayed by Owen Teale, who is at times Jon's ally and later on Jon's enemy, and then Jon's fellow Night's Watch recruits at the time, Pip, Gren, and Rast, who famously Jon kicks all of their asses easily while in training, thinking that he's better than them. They corner him later on.
Explain to me why Jon didn't know this. Like, hey, I'm going to go to this new place, and I'm just going to beat the hell out of...
Well, it's like you mentioned, the idea of him, he grew up as a sheltered kid. He had no idea about any of this, right? He literally grew up his entire life. He probably never stepped foot outside Winterfell once, so he's never experienced anything outside of that, Like, there isn't the internet, so he doesn't exactly know, like, what's going on. Like, he comes from a place of such privilege that he doesn't understand, like, kind of what the common folk have to go through. And that's kind of a big part of his arc throughout the journey, is learning to understand the plights of the common folk, as far as like kind of...
You don't think that he knew or should have known that helping these people and teaching them was the way to go? Like, in episode 1, at least, right? He's always there for Bran. He's always teaching him. He's, a big instrument in trying to progress Bran's learning and how to act in the family. And we see that type of leadership in episode 1, but then it gets to episode 3 and it's like, oh, these are just thieves and criminals. And I guess you're right. I guess I'm answering my own question.
I think the other big thing too,
it's the gap of
it's the gap. It's the gap in social class, but also I think the other big thing too is Jon definitely still has a lot of anger issues that he's kind of taking out on them. He's still pissed obviously about Cat and his position as a bastard, and he's kind of caught in this weird position where, again, even though he knows he's a bastard and even though he still considers himself to be of lower rank, he still feels that because he obviously how he grew up in Winterfell and how he grew up with the rest of the Stark siblings, and mostly just because of with the exception of Cat constantly reminding him, he never really felt any need to feel like he wasn't at home there, and as far as again, with kind of everyone else being subservient to him in some sense, so he's kind of got that weird position that he's trying to work out as far as that goes, and he's kind of taking it out on the rest of his Night's Watch recruits, and it definitely, again, it takes someone like Tyrion who, and again, this is, again, I think part of the brilliance of the show is kind of, again, matching these new up and coming characters with some of the older characters that have kind of gone through this before him, and why I think matching Tyrion up with Jon so early on is such an interesting dynamic, because Tyrion, you can tell, has probably already gone through some sense of this, right? Literally to the point where he much prefers chilling with the common folk. He much prefers chilling with someone like Yoren as opposed to someone like Benjen Stark or someone like Lord Commander Mormont, and just kind of drinking and having fun. And not kind of being reminded of his noble birth. Obviously, he'll use it to his advantage when he needs to, right? But it ultimately takes someone like Tyrion who's been through this to inform Jon. Do you think any of these guys had the stuff that you had growing up? If you were smart, you would use this in order to, help them better themselves rather than constantly belittle them, because that'll get you way farther than anything else. And you see that happen by the end of the episode, obviously.
Yeah, that's a good arc, and that's where my opening joke comes from, right? He's Lord Snow, and he knows his stuff, and he's a good fighter and whatnot. And because of Tyrion's tutelage, he basically gets a gig as a babysitter.
Yeah,
he's gonna watch over these guys, and he's gonna make sure they're safe, and he's gonna take care of them.
Yeah,
and I think it goes to your point, right? They're eventually, hopefully, going to better themselves,
right,
and they're going to be productive members of the Night's Watch.
But more than that, it's going to kind of give him the ability to see and understand people on a more humane level, kind of that base level of humanity that they all have underneath all the social class, which will allow him to eventually, endear himself so close to the wildlings and then to the rest of the Northerners throughout his struggles as he continues to ascend on his way to becoming a leader. And it's why so many people end up following him. Again, it kind of gets into what I thought was the idea of Game of Thrones before, just the last couple seasons kind of just ruined that, which is the idea of, it doesn't matter your birth, the status of your birth. True leadership comes from within and comes from the acts that you do, as far as that goes. And I think that up until a certain point, Game of Thrones did a really good job of demonstrating that, And obviously, before we kind of depart the wall, we see Tyrion having his little interactions first with Mormont, then with Yoren. We have the interaction with Benjen Stark after Benjen tells Jon that he's leaving to go do an expedition north of the wall.
Benjen's really good in this episode.
Yeah, really, really good.
I like, how he tells Jon, you got to earn this.
Yes.
And then immediately Jon, a couple scenes later, he starts to earn it by helping, following Tyrion's advice. The other thing that Benjen does is he goes in and, I don't think he grabs any wine, but he basically confronts Tyrion and, he hates him, for the most part. And
it actually leads to one of my favorite lines. Sorry to cut you off, but it leads to one of my absolute favorite lines. Again, it sucks that this line hasn't been remembered with some of the other iconic Game of Thrones lines, but it's the lines where he says, what's it called? He's like, my brother always said nothing someone says before the word but counts, which is so beyond true. Like, how many times have you heard someone throwing a bunch of compliments your way and seemingly buttering you up, and you can kind of tell, oh, we're sizing ourselves up for something disappointing, and you almost wish it's like, yeah, just get rid of all that shit. I don't need to hear this. Just get to the point,
Yeah, I think the interaction between the two, and at the end of the scene, it's like, I think he's beginning to like me. I think that interaction, it probably is true to a certain degree. Benjen still has his reserved thoughts,
right? His Stark roots, as far as like kind of hating the Lannisters, but also just the fact of like how open Tyrion's been about not necessarily believing in like the cause of the Night's Watch and thinking that they really are just a dumping ground for the realm's criminals.
Yeah, but I think Tyrion's way with words, Benjen understands him better and knows that this guy at least got a brain in there.
Yes.
I think Benjen sort of leaves that conversation with a little bit of respect. Although I don't think that's necessarily going to help Benjen in any way.
Not at all. Especially considering that this is the last time that we see Benjen for four more seasons until season 6, unfortunately. But yeah, before obviously Tyrion departs the wall, he takes his nice piss off the wall that he said he was going to. He shakes hands with Jon, and he also has a quick confrontation with Lord Commander Mormont and the old blind Maester Aemon. Again, absolutely incredible performance from this guy. I believe the actor's name is Peter Vaughn, where they're basically saying, yeah, something is not right. Things are starting to go strange north of the wall as far as the wildlings go, and it's like the Night's Watch is not properly prepared or fueled. We need more help. Can you please talk to your sister and see if you could do something in order to help us?
Dom, what is he saying? He's saying winter is coming.
Winter is coming. It's number. What is it? Number. I feel like we heard it like 3 different times in the pilot. So it's like, and probably one or two. I'm not going to do a track of how many times we hear that phrase, because if we do, we're literally going to be like trying to constantly remember it, and we're already going to be at like 15,000 by the end of one season with the amount of times that line is said throughout the show. So
what I want to say is that this is Jon's like sort of rock bottom moment. That he left his family, he went north to the wall, and basically he learned that the skills that he's developed over his lifetime are not necessarily perfectly honed for his survival here, that he's got to change. And I think he's going to start changing, and we saw it, right? He's helping his fellow recruits, and this early on in the series we see a parallel between Jon and Dany. Right. She just got through her rock bottom period, which was being sold into marriage and, being a slave to start the marriage. And then we get to see that she's now a Khaleesi.
Yes. Yeah. It's interesting how
this episode.
Yeah, it's interesting how, again, even though the show obviously doesn't start this way, it eventually ends up being Jon and Dany's show by the end. But it's interesting to see, like, kind of, even though still they're really little pieces, in as far as this massive puzzle that eventually become more and more isolated as time goes on. It's interesting to see kind of those roots starting as far as getting them both started on their individual tracks to where they'll eventually end up.
They're parallel threads, right? Because they basically both start at rock bottom, and then they're going to have, this roller coaster of successes and failures and figuring it out. And eventually, obviously, they're brought together. But that's what we're going to be paying attention to, is basically them and how they pull themselves up, how they find their place in these sort of corners of the world they never expected themselves to really be.
Yes.
And that's one of the things that the audience is going to enjoy watching.
Yes, absolutely. So 2 more major storylines that really happen in this episode. One is kind of Arya's little mini arc that happens in King's Landing. Obviously, her still kind of reacting, being rightfully kind of really mad at Sansa for everything that happened last episode, kind of blaming her, saying, yeah, Lady would still be alive if you hadn't lied and everything. Ned obviously tries to break down and make her understand. She obviously doesn't understand. And but Arya, again, this is the thing that I always give credit where credit is due, is that Arya always can smell someone's bullshit. Even at the very, very young age that she is when she's first introduced. She's like, I think like 10, I believe, in this first season when we're introduced to her. And even though, again, she doesn't really understand the intricacies, she knows that the Lannisters are not good people, right? But the other thing that I also love that this episode establishes about her is the sense that Ned kind of has this understanding that she's not gonna kind of follow the same rules and regulations that women are typically expected to follow throughout the course of the show. And I think that this is a very, very telling moment for Ned as well, even though he doesn't have as much to do in this episode as he does in the previous 2. Obviously, when he sees her with Needle, when he first catches her with Needle, and then at the end of the episode when he sets her up with, again, one of my favorite character inserts, Syrio Forel, obviously, the first sword of Bravos, who, again, like, it's just the charming moments of the show, man. It's like you have these one little moments. Like, I remember even reading him and saying, oh, God, this guy's such this guy's such a badass, charming character. But, of course, that's just Martin working his little strings, making you fall in love with this guy, and then at the end, brutally killing him off as far as how that goes. It's a real... I still remember his death and his last moment with Arya having, like, a really, really marked impact on me when I watched. Like, I know it's starting to get to, like, the point of, like, over-sentimentality, but I'm like, man, I really loved Syrio Forel,
What I will say is, when I was going through and trying to read the articles of the week, basically I did read, I forgot which one it was. It was not one that I ended up using, but they talked about how this episode was sort of about growing up, right? You know, you had Sansa was gifted a doll by Ned, and she said, I haven't played with dolls since I was 8. And, you know, Arya basically wants to be trained in the art of the sword and not really be constrained by the gender roles of the world. And so that's a sort of an act of growing up. So there's a lot of like life's changing. A lot of the characters are growing up, and it's one of those things where like Ned and you know his wife are basically trapped underneath you know this scheme that is unfolding, and they better wise up, right? They better be the ones that sort of grow up and realize that they're in a dangerous situation and it calls for desperate measures. And you know it's very interesting, it's very subtle, but I think, you know, what do you think? Do you think it really has this undertone, that they're, you know, ill prepared for this life, and you know, like the others, like their children are sort of, you know, better apt to be in this world, even though they're about to, you know, over the course of the next couple of seasons go through some serious you know,
Some serious shit.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, it's part of, again, the generational part of this show is the fact that future characters, obviously, just kind of the generational part of life is that obviously, again, there will be, you know, future generations that will come in and supplant the current generations, obviously, and those new generations are obviously going to bring something new to the table. And it shows, obviously, with the you know, the Starks that survive the show as opposed to the Starks that don't make it. You know, obviously they each go through their own individual circumstances, right? Or you could just believe in the King Robert jinx from the first episode. But I think that the key difference between the Starks that survive the show, and I'm applying this again not just to Arya but to Sansa, Bran, and Jon as well, even though Jon's technically not only half a Stark, but the Starks that survive the show versus the Starks that do not are the Starks that obviously, you know, actually, you know, go through a significant character arc, but also are the Starks that are the ones that obviously, again, like kind of learn and grow throughout the show as opposed to the rest. You know, obviously Sansa with everything that she goes through, and Arya with her quest, everything, and Jon with his quest versus, you know, someone like Robb kind of never leaves his position. No, he kind of goes, he's the eldest of the Starks. He's kind of being prepped for the role in order to inherit Winterfell. And then he's crowned king, and then he's kind of kept in that position and doesn't really undergo any growth or change. It doesn't really get to kind of experience, you know, kind of life from the lowdown the way that the rest of his siblings do. And as a result, that's part of, among many other reasons, that leads to him with being killed. Same thing with Ned. Ned even admits it. Ned knows nothing else other than being a soldier. Ned knows nothing else other than having to rely on his comrades or else he'll die, which makes him very, very, very ill prepared for what he faces in King's Landing, because he's even told by Catelyn, yeah, you can trust Littlefinger, and that proves to be the worst possible advice that comes later on, you know? Especially when Littlefinger is the guy that pulls the knife on him directly. So I feel like that to me is always the, pardon the pun, but stark difference between the Starks that make it through the show as opposed to the Starks that die. And the other thing too is, again, with the exception of Rickon, obviously, who for all intents and purposes is just a plot device later on, all the Starks that die die pretty early on in the show's run.
Well, I think he's really young, and they didn't know what to do with him, and then
right.
he just sort of, you know, became sort of the last Stark that could be used to threaten the others. So mainly, where do you want to go from here? Are you
really, again, just the Daenerys part. Again, with Daenerys is not as much significant stuff happens in Essos across the Narrow Sea. It's really just
she's with child, right?
Yeah, you basically find out that she's pregnant. Obviously, with the Khal, you have this great moment where she starts to like flex her ability as the Khaleesi. Viserys tries to attack her, thinking that she's trying to like give him orders. He's again just continuing to show Viserys is again beyond high IQ as far as that goes, realizing that she's got an entire fucking Khalasar that's completely loyal to her. And obviously, the minute that Jorah finds out that she's pregnant, he immediately leaves to go to Qohor for reasons that are obviously later revealed, because it is unfortunately revealed that he is spying for Robert and the Small Council on Daenerys in order to try and earn his way back to Westeros. Obviously, you know, that will change obviously as time goes on. But
so the main thing is basically that whole scene with her brother. It's like she exercised her first thing of power, and it turns out that she was right. She now has this ability where people are protecting her, and mainly I think this is because, you know, she's pregnant, right? You know, she is now with the sort of heir to the horde, And the way the dynamic is going to be is that she is powerful, she is important. So she for the first time is getting a taste of this power, and we're gonna find out that her brother is not necessarily probably shouldn't have actually arranged this marriage.
Yeah, probably not. Probably not, because it's working less and less in his favor every day as time goes on. So that's really a majority of the things that happen in this episode. Again, it's not an episode that's very, very, hinging on plot overall. But again, there's a lot of really great, awesome character moments, some really awesome moments. And again, as I look back on the show as time goes on, I'm like, oh man, I missed that, as far as that goes. Some great stuff from Arya, some great stuff from Jon, some great stuff from Tyrion, as always, the MVP. But yeah, you wanna get to our focus character segment?
Well, I know. Let me just jump on the article.
Yeah.
Quick,
oh,
right?
yeah, yeah.
So this week, basically, I went to winteriscoming.net to.
Oh, great site. I've consulted them for many a time.
So Rowan Kaiser wrote a review a few years ago, when this aired. And the main thing that he brings up that I wanted to discuss is essentially the whole scene with Robert, right? And
yes.
He's surrounded by Lannisters, and they start telling each other, stories about the first person that they killed. And, this article, the reason why I chose it was because he brings up the point that this is a stark difference between the books and the show, that they sort of created this humorous scene that is funny and enjoyable to watch and brings a different character to the TV show than that of the book. And, it's just like the description of I believe it's one of the Tullys that basically charges Robert thinking he's going to stop the rebellion.
Well, the Tarleys, yeah.
Tarleys.
Yeah. The Tullys fought with Robert because famously the Tarleys are part of the Reach, and the Reach was one of the only regions that stayed loyal to the crown throughout the rebellion.
Well, too many T names, but but anyway,
that's just the tip of the iceberg as far as mispronunciations and confusions within the world. Wait till I tell you how many book characters' names they changed.
But anyway, so basically Robert, talks about killing the first person, and like how they don't tell you about the smell. From the defecation after killing someone. And so there's these sort of gruesome details that just sort of, it's why is the king sitting around drinking wine discussing this? But it's not out of character.
No,
it totally makes sense. And then he calls in Jaime Lannister, and he basically asks him, what did the Mad King say when you struck him down? And Dom?
Yeah, it's Oh, am I supposed to do my best Mad King Aerys Targaryen impression?
Yeah.
No, it's I love this scene because, again, just in addition to continuing with the original scenes that were exclusive to the show and were taken from the books that are just kind of adding more context to characters, the scene is also famous for our introduction to Barristan Selmy, who would go on to become a very, very important character. He obviously starts the show as the leader of Robert and eventually Joffrey's Kingsguard. It just, again, it adds more context to who Robert Baratheon is as a person, kind of expanding upon him in the show, because the thing about Robert is we really only ever saw him through Ned's point of view, but kind of seeing him obviously as his own character, especially how that compares to like the people who he actually has to rule, in this case, the majority of the Lannisters. It's really, really fascinating how he kind of is this guy who's constantly stuck in the past and just can't focus on the present. It's really, really interesting, and kind of that how that eventually leads to his downfall as far as that goes. He's a guy who would just rather sit there and wallow and drink wine and talk about the glories of yesteryear rather than focus on the present. And additionally as well, it's a setup for Jaime as to what Jaime goes through later on, because it's the first time that we hear Jaime obviously utter what Mad King Aerys' last words were, of that being, of course, burn them all, which we obviously later find out what that actually meant.
Yeah, so I would say this scene has one other importance on top of all that you just said, and that's it shows the answer to the question that Ned had in the small council meeting. That's like, how could he bankrupt the realm?
Right.
Or how would Jon Arryn allow him to do so? And it cuts to this scene, and it's like, I'm surrounded by Lannisters, and it's like one of them is serving the wine.
Yeah.
One of them is the head of the Knights.
Poor Lancel Lannister. Robert really makes it easy for him in order to help kill him later on when that happens.
Yeah, so it is, but he's truly surrounded by the Lannisters, like they're embedded in the court, and in the, his security and everything, and he owes the Lannisters $6 million or whatever.
$6 million in gold.
Yeah, so it's the main thing is it is a crucial scene to show humor in the show and the universe, but it also shows the Lannisters really have the one up on pretty much this situation. They've locked it down.
Just everything.
The throne is theirs. Which also begs my one question is like, why did they have to just start slaughtering everybody? Like,
right. Well, not even that. Just if that was the case again, it's like why did they even bother with why did Jaime even bother to succeed the throne to Robert? Because remember, right? That's the big thing about the sack of King's Landing is that Ned and Robert's only real victory was murdering Rhaegar on the Triton. The Lannisters were the ones that oversaw the sack of King's Landing. It was Gregor Clegane, obviously the Hound's brother, Tywin Lannister's, dog, as is known, that brutally murdered Rhaegar's wife and children, or at least so we think, So it's like and Jaime, when Ned got to King's Landing, he found Jaime sitting on the throne. So what? It still kind of baffles me to this day because I feel like the Lannisters would have solved a lot of the problems that they end up running into later on with the Baratheons if they had just taken the throne for themselves rather than ceded it to Robert in that instance,
Yeah, but the argument's going to be that if they did cede it at that point,
if they did not cede it, you mean?
Yeah, if they took the throne, yeah,
right.
Basically, they would have
had to fight Robert and Ned's forces right there.
Yeah, another war.
Right.
So that's it's a very complicated thing that they don't necessarily, they kind of gloss over these things.
Right.
And that's the tidbits that you're looking for and trying to kind of think about.
Right. And so obviously, again, it leads up to them planning, to remove Roberts. That way they can ensure the seamless transition. Obviously, it's just the Stark involvement that kind of throws everything off kilter and kind of inevitably starts the War of the Five Kings. Because again, to me, if Ned never gets involved and the plan goes through to murder Robert, Ned would have been pissed probably, but he probably would have been too far away to really do anything about it. He probably would have expected it given, just how unhealthy Robert was, and it probably would have been a seamless transition of power from Robert to Joffrey with no cause for bloodshed. But because it's Ned's direct involvement that leads to, obviously, Robert's brothers, opposing the crown later on and would lead into the War of the Five Kings.
Yeah. All right, Dom.
Yes.
I'm looking at the clock like I'm Michael Jordan, and it's we got to let that ball go.
Yeah, we got to let that ball drop. So focus character time today. Our focus.
Jump to the next segment. Yeah.
Yes, our focus character is he has been known as Aegon Targaryen II. He has been known as Lord Snow. He has been known as the Bastard. He has been known as the King of the North. He has been known by many other titles, but to us, he will always be known as Jon Snow, portrayed by Kit Harington, brought back after the initial, brought back after Robert's rebellion, supposedly under the guise as Ned Stark's bastard. Obviously, we now know that Jon was born to Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen at the end of the war. In a way, his subsequent conception and birth was a part of what led, obviously, to Robert's rebellion in some small way. But Jon goes the majority of the show. Jon and us go the majority of the show without knowing his true identity, right? And so Jon is in a very interesting predicament, right? And again, it's kind of part of the reason why he's a very interesting kind of opposite end to Daenerys' coin, which is that where Daenerys obviously, comes knowing her lineage, but had to grow up in this place of desolation and, kind of, again, being sold as property and kind of really having to earn her stripes. Jon, as opposed to her, grew up in a place of privilege, but chose to give that up based on kind of the foresight and the knowledge that he was never really going to attain the level that his siblings that he grew up with would be, or in this case, his half siblings, or as we later come to find out, his cousins would grow up to attain. So he chooses to forego any potential title that he could earn in order to, place himself amongst, the rest of the people of the Night's Watch, who are a place that is often more reserved for the commoners in, the commoners of the realm, So it's interesting how both of them kind of inevitably find their way in that position of having to earn their title as opposed to getting it, right? But it sets Jon off on this very interesting trajectory where even though he's a character that's constantly at odds with himself, right? He's a character who, on one hand, internally is striving for glory, but he's also a character that sees firsthand many, many times what said glory, actually the responsibilities and kind of, harm and stakes that said glory pertains. You know, obviously once it becomes Lord Commander of the Night's Watch and later on King in the North. And so he kind of, once he finally gets to those positions of responsibility, he kind of seeks to do nothing but get away from that. You know, like what's kind of your whole take on Jon's character arc?
Well, Dom, really, I think the main thing that's happening right now in episode 3 is he has to live up to Ned Stark's expectation of his children,
Right.
Even though he's a bastard and he's not going to obtain, Winterfell, or at least he thinks. Basically, he is trying to uphold an oath. He understands that that's Ned's main point, is that you have to commit to something and you have to live that, and you have to basically, to really be, for Ned to be proud, you have to show that you are going to carry an oath to its end. And that's why Jon takes this, never ending oath of the Night's Watch, because he's going to show Ned that he's the most devoted of all the children. And, I think that's really what's happening in the back of his mind. And, the glory and stuff like that he's going to get is the fact that he's going to protect the realm and he's going to keep everyone safe. And, he's sort of naive in the sense that people are going to come visit him and he's going to show them around. He's going to take them beyond the wall. And, that's not going to happen. Basically it's not a vacation spot.
Right.
So
not at all.
It's interesting to see him learn about what's happening at the wall. Eventually he goes out beyond the wall, and, he basically is committed to this oath until, it finally dawns upon him at some point in the series, and we'll find that moment when we get to it.
Oh yeah.
But he's going to realize that this whole thing of tying his hitch to this oath of the Night's Watch, that's not what he's meant to do. Like, he's trying to, he's going to find out Ned, ain't around at some point.
Real soon too.
So the fact is, Jon's going to basically have, he's going to be stuck with this oath because that's what Ned taught him to be. But eventually he's going to
discover the burden that comes with that oath.
Yeah. He's going to realize that, the oath was for a different time. And I think this goes back to the generational thing, right? It's the Night's Watch dies in this, series, right, that we're watching. And the Night's Watch, you could argue, is dead by the time Jon gets to it.
Kind of, yeah. It really kind of, the Night's Watch is definitely on its last breath and is kind of like dying a slow death, throughout the course of the show.
Yeah, well, they can't even man any of the castles,
right? They've literally only have 3 castles. They only have 3 castles manned. 2 of those 3 castles are obviously we see throughout the show, but we never see the Shadow Tower, obviously, which is famously the tower East watches. So you got Castle Black, which is kind of quick geography lesson, but as far as the topography of the wall goes, you have Castle Black, which is dead in the center, right? You have East Watch, which we see in season 7, which is all the way obviously to the east on the shore of the Narrow Sea, right? Obviously that's the kind of the border between the wall and Hardhome. But then we never even see the Shadow Tower, which is the tower all the way to the west of the wall, bordering, the sea that obviously leads to the Iron Islands, and eventually, out west to, the unknown lands of the leads to the whole what's west of Westeros thing. But it's they're dying a slow death. They don't have enough, people to man the wall. And again, the Night's Watch, which we'll get to in our GOT-chaverse segment, is again, it feels like it's overall is an extension of that kind of that dying old world.
Yeah, well, I don't know if there's much to more to talk about Jon. We're gonna watch him.
Yeah, we're gonna see it. The only
realization, and that's that.
The only real thing that I have to add on Jon as far as that goes is and I kind of wanted to hit this now, is kind of what happens as far as. Again, not to offer any kind of light yet, because I want to save it for when we get to the finale, but kind of trying to light out as to what one of the many problems in the finale is. To me, the biggest difference that I noticed between the Jon Snow in season 7 and the Jon Snow in season 8 is and I don't know if this is just a chalk up to, again, just the writing, how they decided to take his character, or just the fact that there just weren't enough episodes in order to justify it. But Jon goes from an active character who is still fighting for the safety of his people and trying to get as many allies as they can in order to save everyone from the White Walkers, to being just a pretty passive character, and kind of just in the throes of Daenerys' clutches pretty quickly. And it kind of, to me, robs him of the agency that made us grow to love him as time goes on,
I think ultimately, this is a bigger conversation for when we actually get to season 8.
But just to shine a little bit of light on that for now,
Yeah,
as far as Jon starts off being a pretty active character. He was even at his most lightest, he was never really that passive of a character.
Yeah, but the thing is, if we remember season 8, basically they kill the Night King, pretty early on in the season.
Yeah.
And then he has no reason to be active at that point because his goal is achieved. So I think it has to do with the fact that particular story event happens early in season 8. And it really doesn't, I think a lot of the audience, including myself, expected the Night King to be the final battle.
Right.
And,
they not even just what you were expecting. It was literally told to us in the first episode, this is the final boss,
Yeah. So, it's one of those things that, hey, listen, it's, I guess a lot of fans, including myself, didn't feel season 8 was the best. Personally, I was ready by probably the end of season 6 for the show to be concluded. So,
yeah, I feel like that's where a lot of people were aiming towards.
Yeah, so for season 7 and 8, I just was along for the ride. It was what it was. I enjoyed, a lot of the episodes. And, the show wrapped up. And I thought, it's really now about, does the entire 8th season speak for itself? And
yes,
I would argue right now we're 3 episodes in. We'll find out and have this conversation over more episodes. But I think it does.
Yes.
So,
absolutely.
I think, again, we'll talk about Jon being a passive character towards the end of the series when we get there.
Obviously,
but let's hit up the Night's Watch.
So we are now getting into the GOT-chaverse segment overall, which of course is the segment where we talk about an element from the world of Westeros, the world of ice and fire, obviously, that we've come to know. On the first episode, we obviously talked about the history of the Starks. This is the last episode we talked about Robert's Rebellion, and in this episode, we're going to talk about the Night's Watch, which is a sworn brotherhood military order that basically oversees kind of and protects the realm, the entire realm, that being the north and all of the south, from the forces that are to the north of the realm. It's always interesting to me, kind of just how the topography works, right? Because obviously Westeros and Essos are very clearly modeled after, North and South America kind of combined, and Asia, obviously, some combined version of, this massive version of Asia with a couple different, subsects, obviously. But then you have this whole region north of the wall that just seemingly just goes up forever, and obviously we know that, in our world, right, North America eventually, kind of branches off and merges with the Arctic, but it's it just keeps going north and north. Obviously, you have the parts that were plotted out by the Night's Watch, obviously, and then there's just the land that just nobody knows how far those go. It's just a what's it called? It's just on any of the Westerosi maps, you'll see it just says the lands of unknown winter on this, but basically, yeah, the Night's Watch is obviously established by the, in order to oversee the wall and run the wall and protect them from people that were north of them, like wildlings and White Walkers. Obviously, they're organized into 3 separate departments. The Rangers, who obviously fight and, do the tracking missions north. You have the Stewards, who maintain the obviously maintain everything with the latrine pipes and the castles and everything. And then you have and then you have the stewards, who are basically kind of the bosses, right? The ones who oversee everything, right? I just probably got my terms mixed up. Did I say stewards or builders before? The builders are the ones that maintain and oversee everything. The stewards are the ones that are kind of the bosses and are in control of everything, right?
Does the show really address the tree diggers?
I think once. I think they make a joke about it once, when Jon becomes Lord Commander, and he's like, we need a new latrine pipe built, and everyone kind of just laughs it off as far as that goes. But yeah, so according to legend, the Night's Watch was founded 8,000 years ago overall. Members of the Night's Watch obviously swear an oath of duty that prohibits marriage, family, and land ownership, which lasts until their death. So it's like the Supreme Court. You're in it for life. You're in it until you die. Only death can free you from your vows, as is later seen, obviously. But even with that being said, though, there are obviously still make exceptions. Night's Watchmen can flee south to Molltown in order to, finagle with the women of the night that stay there. Obviously, many a Night's Watchmen have broken their vows. Obviously, as we all know, the penalty for breaking your vows is death, as we saw in the first episode. However, there are obviously
little asterisks in the oath.
Yeah, there are a couple of asterisks that get revealed as time goes on.
only if we can enforce it, right?
Right,
Like
which becomes adamantly clear as time goes on that the enforcement policies for actually maintaining these vows are not exactly the best, as we see obviously in season 3 when you have just a section of the Night's Watch members who again are largely made up of criminals that we would like to add, just betraying and just casually murdering their Lord Commander just because they're like sick of everything. So yeah, obviously again, this is not what's it called? There have been vast exceptions that have been made to this rule. For instance, Stannis, obviously, when he comes north to and settles in Castle Black at the beginning of season 5, offers to free Jon from his vows and declare him as Jon Stark, king in the north. So there are obviously exceptions to the rule. It really is definitely, again, just an instance of the old world kind of, and these vows and these kind of oaths that they make for life are not necessarily as set in stone as they think. It really is just a matter of it's up to the individual people in order to maintain them, and it really is kind of just and that I also think builds into the conversation that Cersei has with Joffrey at the end of the day, which is that the rule of law of the day really only rests on the current ruler, and there really is no kind of strict set of oaths that kind of govern people's lives the way that kind of we may have thought growing up overall. They're obviously, they describe themselves as sworn brothers. They see themselves obviously more so as comrades than anything else. The whole idea is of the Night's Watch is that when you join it, right, it's the idea of there is no kind of set hierarchy as far as the status of one's birth. It's once you join the Night's Watch, that's all you are, is a brother of the Night's Watch. They're comprised of High Lords, they're composed of bastards, they're composed of just farmers, criminals, literally any status of social class that you had. Obviously, famously, you have Jorah Mormont and you have Jon Snow and you have Benjen Stark, who are members of high houses, and then you have other people who like Gren and Pip, who don't even have last names. They're just came from farms.
Well, Tom, we hear it in episode 3. Like, basically, you are nobody here, you earn it. And so, yes, okay, so Mormont might be someone that probably came in and got fast-tracked into the, commander. But for the most part, you go there and you have to prove yourself. So, in some sort of past history, Commander Mormont did something to earn this role.
Right.
We just don't get to see it really, in this series.
Right. But, it's almost gotten to the point where the Night's Watch, again, Tyrion is clearly not the only person that looks down on them, right? It's kind of just like a place to, kind of send all the unwanted people, as we see in the next episode, obviously, once we meet Samwell Tarly. Samwell Tarly was literally disavowed by his father for thinking that he's too weak to rule anyone and is sent to the Night's Watch as punishment, basically, kind of thinking that, he's not going to last there too long, and the Night's Watch ends up being the best thing possible for Sam as far as helping him, learn to become a man as far as that goes. Not to be too preemptive, but, it's kind of always been interesting to me as kind of the perception of the Night's Watch versus what people hold it to be. And even though we kind of see the Night's Watch die a slow death throughout it, it's interesting to me how it's still kind of bendable and flexible. Is okay, the Night's Watch may have stood to mean this thing once, but that doesn't mean that it, that there's no place for it. Obviously, the Night's Watch has to hold their own multiple times throughout the course of the series. First, obviously, when they journey north and are attacked by the Whites for the first time in season 2. Then, obviously, when they have to hold their own against Mance Rayder's forces in season 4, obviously. And then, of course, obviously, when they're split down the middle once, what's it called? Once Jon is assassinated by Alistair Thorne and the rest, and they have to kind of decide where their loyalties are. Afterwards, again, the last 2 seasons, again, we'll get to that when we get to that. But as far as that goes, that's kind of what the Night's Watch plays in the rest of the world. And it's always been interesting to me because it's kind of always had its own little weird sect as far as in the realm, because they're not a royal family, right? So they don't necessarily participate in the squabbles of the realm, but they're still just as crucially important in the overall story of Westeros as really any one of these other families are. So that's really kind of all that I have to say as far as the Night's Watch and the rest of the GOT-chaverse goes.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing about the Night's Watch is that, we see it crumble. We see really the last ditch effort to keep it going, to hold to the oath. There are, these key characters that are trying to do the right thing over the course of these 8 seasons. And then at the end of the show, we're left to think that there is some big reform coming to the Night's Watch. Yes. And it's going to be, all the problems are going to be fixed.
Yeah, so
this show sort of ends with that happy fairy tale ending. But we got to
Jon is just yeet, see ya, and just goes north with the wildlings.
Yeah, the only thing I think about when I look at north of the wall, it's all this tundra and snow and stuff.
Right.
My video game brain turns on, and I think of Civilization 6 with Canada, and they would be perfect for cities up there with some hockey rinks and stuff like that. So anybody that likes strategy games, you'll get my reference. But anyway, Dom, it's time to bring up the chat, right?
Yes, the chat, definitely.
We
got a few interesting comments, mostly from our resident Game of Thrones fanboy Eric Thorpe Reviews. But again, thank you, Eric, for tuning in and being such a consistent watcher overall. His point that he brought up is he did not agree with your thoughts on the pilot. He said, "Whoa, the pilot is great." Better than the Sopranos and Breaking Bad pilot. That's where I'm going to hard disagree with you. That's where I'm going to hard disagree with you as far as it goes. Again, it's different. Obviously, I think that every pilot kind of serves its different purpose as far as for the purposes of the show. But I could definitely say that Sopranos and Breaking Bad both objectively have better pilots than Game of Thrones. He also brought up, I definitely think Littlefinger is a little piece of shit. That's why he won't take any nonsense from him. I think he could take a joke from someone that he respected. For him, every episode is great. Another interesting point that he brought up is
well, I don't know if every episode is great.
I definitely don't think that every episode is great. Every episode definitely plays its part, definitely. But
what I will say is that every episode has a level of entertainment and progresses things, and therefore it ties into those great moments.
Yes,
right?
definitely.
So great is a strong word, but definitely everything builds up to those show defining moments.
Yes. The other thing that I'll say too is he says for him, season 4 to 6 is really the sweet spot of the series. The pace and plot really amp up from the first 3, but still have time to breathe in maintaining the 10 episode length of the first 3. I'll definitely say that as far as kind of my thoughts go, season 4 is still my favorite season, and we'll get to that when we get to that. Season 5, I'm not a big fan of, for kind of the vast amount that they have to cover in order for this, since the fact that season is pulling double duty as far as adapting 2 books rather than 1, and the amount of stuff that kind of gets brushed over and left off to the side is kind of unsatisfying, along with the fact that, to me, that's where a lot of the problems that kind of rear their ugly heads with the last 2 seasons kind of come into play. Season 6 I love, but I think it has problems overall. And that's really a majority of the comments that we have. Also, I just wanted to give a shout out to my buddy Pete, aka the Militia Gamer, who I haven't talked to him in a minute. Thanks for stopping by, Pete. It's always a pleasure, obviously, seeing and hearing from you. It's definitely hit me up sometime overall. It's been too long since we've seen each other. But that's really it as far as the comments go. The only thing that I have to bring up is we don't have as much to talk about in the death counter today because unless I missed something, there were no people that died in this episode. So I will see if this is. There was definitely a death ticker as far as that goes. This is only one of 5 episodes in the entire show where there are no deaths. But obviously we'll have to keep track of that as far as as time goes on with the show.
Yeah, basically, I did read a review, looking for the review articles that was basically saying, "Oh, there was no deaths, but there was some violence towards Varys." Or whatever, the whip, and whatnot.
Violence towards, you mean towards Littlefinger when Ned almost strangles him?
Well, that too. But it was basically the whip around the neck,
Viserys, yeah.
Viserys, yeah.
Again, so you said Varys, I'm like, what?
More V.
A lot of more similar sounding names.
Yeah, I'm gonna mix up the names here and there. Just correct me anytime. Yeah. It makes total sense.
Like I said, I've read these books religiously. That's the only reason why I know the difference between Viserys and Varys and Tully and Tarly, and it's a lot. It's a lot to remember. But
yeah. Anyway, I'm looking forward to the next episode. We'll see what happens. We'll see what we
definitely.
Think. I think obviously episode 2 is the star of the first 3 episodes.
It's definitely star of the first 3, to say the least.
There are a lot of cool characters introduced here. And going forward for the next couple episodes, we're gonna start heating up because we're getting closer and closer to that season 1
moment. That season 1, but Pet Ultimate and Ultimate. I mean, the finale is quite literally called Fire and Blood, so I feel like that unintentional pun was perfectly utilized there. But people, that was it. That was our 3rd episode of Talkin Thrones overall, entitled Lord Snow. Let us know what you thought in the comments section below. Be sure to tune in next week for our next episode, where we will be covering episode 4 of season 1, entitled Cripples, Bastards, and Broken Things. Let us know your thoughts once again in the comment section below. Let us know what your thoughts thoughts on Jon Snow are. Let us know what your thoughts are just on everything in general in the show. Be sure to keep coming back every week for new episodes of Talkin Thrones. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Talkin TV. We are putting up content as much as we possibly can in order to continue to give you, the audience, the content that you deserve.
Do you know what the best part about hitting the subscribe button for Talkin TV?
Let's hear it. What is the best part about hitting the subscribe button for Talkin TV?
You don't have to give up your titles. You don't have to give up a spouse. You don't have to give up any of the things that
you don't have to give up your land. You don't have to worry about never being with a woman or never fathering a child. You don't have to worry about all of that when you hit the subscribe button.
Hit the subscribe button.
Just hit the subscribe button. It takes no extra skin off your back.
Yeah, you're part of the Talkin Thrones watch.
Yes, you're part of the Talkin Thrones family is what you're a part of. If you click the subscribe button and you hit the bell next to it, that way you get notified every time we put up new content. Be sure to also click the thumbs up button on this video if you liked it, or don't. Like I said, just in general, honesty helps. I always prefer honesty just in general. Be sure to also follow us on our social media platforms, Facebook and Instagram at Talkin TV or at Talkin TV Podcast. Pat, where can the good people find you on the interwebs?
Hey, I keep threatening that I'm going to post something on Instagram, and I came close. I actually took some photos.
Oh, man.
On my cell phone, but I just didn't fire up the Instagram app. But you can find me at Patrick W. Huber on Instagram. Again, I will post those photos when I get to it.
Absolutely. And you can follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Movie Nerd Reviews, where I post sarcastic posts just kind of making fun of Hollywood and the industry, because even though I love movies, I kind of can't stand them and their practices overall. So hit me up there if you want to see some more potentially comedic posts, and also if you just want to see more movie news and trailers that I try to post as often as possible. And as always, people remember, 12 seasons in a short film, watch more fucking movies, and as always,
wear more black, right? For the Night's Watch.
For the watch overall. We'll see you guys next week on the next episode of Talkin Thrones.